certainly one of the most active members of the Sen Parliamentary Core Sustainable, raising concerns about the sourcing of the wood for fuel, the implements, so please do get thinking about that. If you'd like to tweet along, we're
This discussion is about woody biomass, and that in my mind there is quite a distinct difference. That I came to this conversation somewhat inadvertently, that I also chair the all-party parliamentary group for wood panelling, which isn't the nice fancy stuff we've got at Westminster. It's probably what's inside this table. It's how many of our houses are constructed, and I had a plant in my patch that used recycled wood to make furniture. Unfortunately, it's currently mothballed because they lost their B&Q contract. But I think it's given me a real insight, and we fought against the Renewable Heat Index previously when I was first elected, to really look at the other side of burning wood, which is that actually we need wood if we're going to build the houses that we need. And when you build a house with wood in it, the carbon is retained within that. And that by burning wood, we have created a wood security issue for the country, which has sent the price of wood skyrocketing, and we are having to import wood to build with. So I think there's a sort of another side to this long before we look at, is this a good use for wood? And at any level that you look at wood and the uses of wood, burning it is the least productive and the least beneficial to the environment. So I come from that perspective as a starting point. But I also feel quite strongly that as we go through transition is complicated, it's difficult, and the science changes. And I think at a very basic level, it's very easy to say, I cut down a tree, I burn a tree, I plant a tree, therefore this is a renewable cycle. It's a great sadness to me that Dr. Dan Quiggin isn't here with us today, because his explanation of this is significantly better than mine. But the reality is that the trees that have been there for 50 years retain far more carbon than the new ones that are planted. It takes 50 years for this to become a renewable cycle, and we don't have 50 years to get to net zero. I think as somebody who's also championed floating offshore wind and lived through the disappointment of AR5, when people are confused about how a strike price works, it's not a subsidy. Why do we continue to pay a subsidy for people to burn wood and generate power at actually what is the most polluting point in the country? And so in my mind, the science has moved on from where we started, and that as we go through transition, we have to take difficult decisions, including reopening oil and gas fields, finding new ones, and we need to burn wood at the moment. It is 6% of our energy supply. It is the base layer until we've got our nuclear up and running. I get all of those things, but I don't believe we should be subsidising it. So in my mind, we need to be pragmatic, and it's not a fuel source that can grow. It was very fascinating about a year ago, maybe 18 months ago, Sen hosted an event with international countries and Scandinavia, where they have a much higher tree density and a much lower population. Their use of woody biomass is a completely different conversation. We have a very, very low density of tree planting. This morning I've met again, I've been meeting with the DEFRA minister to find out when is the land use strategy coming through. You know, we're a small island and we're competing for what that land is used for. And my personal belief, as somebody, I don't use the word crisis lightly, I have a housing crisis in my constituency, I would rather fight to have trees go up if they're coming back down again to build things with so the carbon stays in the tree than to burn them. But I also recognise that we do need to get through transition, but I don't think, my personal view is very strongly that we should subsidise what actually is increasingly being proven by the science, not the politics, the science actually is a polluting form of energy.
Thank you very much, Selaine. Maxwell, Marlow.
I'm of the same mind with Selaine actually on this. Last year we gave Drax, sorry to use the D word there, £617 million. That's a hospital in subsidies to pay for this quite primitive form of energy production. You see, it doesn't help, unfortunately, that the Department for Energy Security Net Zero haven't published their net zero strategy properly yet, and that's why they've been sued twice over it. So we're going to do the job for them at the ASI and see what happens. But biomass will not be included in that, mainly because it doesn't work as a business model. If you look at their financial modelling and their financial health, it is deeply, deeply poor, and it's not a healthy way to essentially base a lot of your energy security on for heating businesses. I mean, really, at the end of the day, as I said, I'm with Selaine on this. I mean, we need to have a very broad mixture of heat and electricity for our energy grid. And unfortunately, there are areas the government could improve. I mean, Penny Mordaunt, for example, is blocking Aquawind, which is an energy interconnector with France, which could provide up to 5% of our energy capacity, all nuclear and clean, and we can send some back to them instead of paying off windmills to not produce any energy. So there are things like that, but biomass, I think, I'm keeping my remarks very short because I think Selaine's already covered a lot of this. It's not the way forward. Economically unadvantageous, very primitive. Cutting down trees in North Carolina, putting them on ships and sending them over here is not a reliable source of, producing a healthy economy and a healthy energy environment.
Thank you very much, Maxwell. Mark, some strong words, it's fair to say so far. We're grateful to hear your views from the REA.
Thank you. So just to introduce the REA very briefly, we're the Association for Renewable Energy and Clean Technology. We're the UK's largest trade body, and we represent renewable technologies right across power, heat and transport. So not just bioenergy, but wind, solar and everything. And the reason we do that is because we think we need it all. And that's what all of the transition arrangements and scenarios to get to net zero demonstrate. We need everything. So trying to offset this and say, but we can do it all with wind or we can do it all with solar. We absolutely need wind and solar. No doubt about that. We need to be going all guns for it. But we also need bioenergy because it plays such an important role. The history of bioenergy demonstrates how we've got to where we are today. So back in the 1990s, we were looking at a lot of waste coming out of the forestry and timber sectors. Selaine mentioned the use of forestry within a wide range of the bioeconomy, including buildings. If you build houses with wood, that's an incredibly important thing to do. It does, as Selaine said, lock away carbon. You can't use a whole tree just to build a house. There's a lot of offcuts from that. It creates a lot of waste. Same when you produce paper, same when you do anything. Also, when you look at forestry management, you look at how you manage that forest sustainably and appropriately so it is as productive as possible, and that includes creating thinnings so that you can create a healthy and robust forest. That also reduces wildfires and reduces diseases. All of this is about using the forest effectively and appropriately, and that uses waste wood to do that, and the lowest value wood goes to bioenergy. So we're not talking about bioenergy leading on forestry economics. This is about providing additional revenue on top of that revenue that foresters, landowners, agricultural farmers get for that feedstock. It's also really important to remember that this is quite a diverse sector. Now, this discussion, I suspect, will focus on pellet production, and I'm very happy to talk about that and talk in relation to the fact that we import pellets from America. But it's also important to recognise that here in the UK, we have 60 to 70 biomass power plants, ranging in size. We have the very large guys like Trax and Lynmouth, who are members of the RA for full disclosure, but we also have a lot of other members who use things like waste wood. So if you're looking at the panel board industry, those panel boards will at some point get taken out and end up in the circular economy and end up in waste wood production. And waste wood bioenergy sites. And we also have members that use energy crops and other waste streams. So things like straw or other food waste coming from different sectors. So this is a varied sector. And when talking about bioenergy, when we're talking about BECCS, you have to think about all of it and where BECCS can be done, including on energy from waste, including on biomass power sites. So looking to the future, and what this discussion is focused on, is the value of BECCS. And the industry is very, very clear. It completely recognised that its future involves carbon capture and storage and delivering that. Why is carbon capture and storage so important? Well, there is no scenario, whether it be the Committee on Climate Change, the IPCC, the International Energy Agency, or the National Grid, future energy scenarios, they all have a role for BECCS. They all identify an important role for BECCS. Why do they do that? Because, as the IPCC said in their last working group paper, the deployment of carbon dioxide removal to counterbalance hard-to-abate residual emissions is unavoidable if net zero CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions are to be achieved. This isn't a question of either or, this is a question of we have to do this, and therefore the important piece is how do we do it correctly? And the industry is fully on board in ensuring this is done correctly. The UK currently has some of the strongest sustainability governance arrangements for bioenergy. Everything, any kind of support that is delivered has to be within strong sustainability arrangements that look at the full life cycle emissions of where that biomass feedstocks come from. So that includes the growth in the forests, the transportation across the seas, and the burning of it in the UK. to reassert that point, this month, a few months ago, the government issued its biomass strategy, which highlighted that within their priority use framework, that by 2050 they want to see BECCS being the primary use of bioenergy. Accompanying that report was a scientific report produced by a body of scientists, so the Task and Finish Group for BECCS, led by Professor Paul Monks, who's the Senior Scientific Advisor to the Department for Energy Storage, Energy Security and Net Zero, in which he concluded there is no significant or insurmountable scientific barriers to permanent removal of CO2 from the atmosphere using BECCS with sustainable supply chains and that are well regulated. So finally to say, in using BECCS and using bioenergy, we do not assume that it is neutral on CO2. We do not assume it is negative. The point is, if you do it correctly, it can be those things, and that is crucially important. The industry now look forward to working with the government on the development of its cross-sectoral sustainability framework. This recognises that if you're using biomass for power, transport, heat, there are different governance arrangements there. They're strong, but we could do better, and we want to create that framework across all of them, and that'll be a crucial piece of work next year. But the point is, we want to develop these conversations away from just should we or should we not. Recognise that we absolutely do need this, and therefore it cannot be a polarised discussion of yes or no. It's a discussion of how do we make sure we do this correctly.
Thank you, Mark, very much. And last but by no means least, Kate.
Thank you. So I've got some problems and some solutions for you. 4 problems and then a few solutions. The first thing is that, as Selaine and Max said, BECCS may not deliver negative emissions, especially if we're talking about burning wood from forests. And I can talk in a bit more detail about that in a minute if others have questions on it. The second thing is that BECCS is a jam tomorrow solution. It allows people, organisations, companies to keep polluting in the certainty that we will be able to capture carbon through BECCS in the future. It's a massive gamble. It doesn't yet exist at scale. The third thing is that whether you're talking about wood or whether you're talking about energy crops, either way, it relies on huge land use, which we don't have in the UK, with much, much lower use of BECCS. We're not denying there won't be any, but it could be tiny, and we definitely shouldn't be subsidising it at the scale that we are now, as Max said. The report will be published in the next few months. Happy to share that with anyone who would like to see it. We've looked at the various pathways, and the report shows a number of different options there. But the good news is that we're tackling one of the major things already here in the UK by rewarding farmers to grow nature alongside food. We don't need to cut down trees and then regrow them to do this. We can just maintain the forests both here and elsewhere that we have already, and share our land for food and nature at the same time. The second thing we could be doing is growing energy crops at home, taking account of the land use challenge that I just said. We also need to encourage people to have healthier diets. And then the last thing is that we need to get the wealthiest to pay a little bit more for flying. So those are some of the options and scenarios we've been looking at. There's much more detail in the report to come. But there are choices. We don't have to go down this road. We don't have to be spending billions on subsidising Drax and others when we have alternatives already. We're making a huge gamble on a technology that doesn't yet exist at scale. At WWF, we often talk about the triple challenge. Need to tackle climate to reach our climate targets, to reach our really ambitious nature targets for 2030, and then also to reach our nutrition targets, so that our unstated targets, as it happens, to feed our population with healthy food without offshoring our impact abroad in a very limited space of land here in the UK. In terms of climate, we don't need to burn wood to reach net zero, or nearly as much as is being suggested. On nature, why would you cut down trees to burn them? It's just sort of odd. And then on nutrition, this could all use up a whole lot of land that could otherwise be used for food. The alternative is to let nature recover and share nature with our land and with our hardworking farmers, and that's what we think we should be doing instead.
Thank you, Kate, very much. I'm going to briefly abuse my position as chair by going back to each of the panellists with a question, but do please be thinking of yours, and we'll pass the mic around shortly. Selaine, I want to come back to you first. I mean, you've made a lot of criticisms along with Maxwell and Kate about BECCS and about biomass. But if I were to say to you at the moment, 6.5% of electricity already generated, a plan to deal with it, which I appreciate you have some concerns about, but through BECCS, a real need to hit not just our 2050 net zero target, but our short-term targets as well. Do we really have time to be fiddling about with the alternatives, or do we need to accept biomass as something that we just needs to be part of the mix? Yes, along with solar and wind, but there's been a problem, which you alluded to, with the auction round and the CFDs this year for offshore wind. Is this fiddling while Rome burns?
Well, Rome has certainly been burning, but I think we need to very much be looking for solutions. And as I think I said in my opening remarks, there is a need for pragmatism about this, and I fully accept that Drax and woody biomass at this point in time is our baseload. We don't have an alternative, and it needs to remain. That doesn't mean the government has to subsidise it. And I think for me, this is about the subsidy. And we're worried about the cost of living crisis. We're worried about the cost of energy for consumers. And that's been stated as part of the reasons that things went wrong in AR5, which, again, anyone that's done the analysis will know that's not right either. But if we are serious about actually how we spend taxpayers' money, should we be subsidising this? Or is it a viable business? And I think if we're not going to subsidise some of the other energy forms, which is very much the direction of travel, that these should stand on their own 2 feet, I think we need to really recognise that if these are viable businesses, and I accept we need them right now, I'm not somebody who's suggesting we must turn everything off, but I do think we need to get on and turn some other things on, and that actually gets some more wind turbines up, get some things floating out there. And yet it's great to look at geothermal and all the other technologies. I look at transition as being like a delta, a river delta, as it goes down. Not everything's ever going to get to the sea on those tributaries, but the science and the analysis will change of that science as we go through it. And I think, very much in the way Mark described how this industry came into being, we now know more about this than we did when the industry came into being. And then I think it would be naive of us as a science superpower, which actually as a country we really are, to ignore the science that has come on board since, and that we have to accept this is part of it. I completely acknowledge that, but I have a real issue with the level of subsidy going into this, particularly when other far more renewable energy sources didn't get the go-ahead in AR5, and I think there is a real need within the department for somebody to actually put a proper strategy together that properly analyses the actual road to net zero, the carbon capture storage, and BECCS. We still don't know. BECCS is still a new technology, like floating offshore wind is a new technology. Until we start trying to see if it works, we don't know if it works. And I feel we need to throw the dice for every energy, and as we find that they've got problems, we need to then redress that mix as we go through.
Thank you. Kate, I'm going to come to you next. I wonder if you could come back on some of the points Mark made. As he pointed out quite rightly, the CCC includes biomass as a big part of its projections to net zero. The IEA does. This is something that's recognised by a lot of the experts, maybe as a necessary evil, but at very least that. And is it realistic for those of us who believe passionately that we need to get to net zero and hit our climate targets? Is it realistic for us to say, we can't do that, we've got to find something else? I feel frustration sometimes that the environmental sector is very good at saying what it doesn't want. But I think, how do we make sure, if we aren't going to do it, that we really ramp up those solutions, crucially in time?
Yeah, no, I hear that impatience, and I agree with Selaine on that we can't just slam something without talking about solutions. And we have got, there are some difficult decisions coming up. But there are some things to do where we've got the technology already, where it's less of a gamble. I actually just focusing on the demand side for energy, I think is something. It's such an obvious thing to do. I heard yesterday that if we just required houses at EPC of D to go up to C, then we'd have saved 17% of gas imports over the course of the last year or something. Don't quote me on that actual stat, but it's pretty significant. And I think the challenge is that we're pouring subsidy into completely the wrong things. We should be thinking much more creatively about how we can get there, and instead of, you know, the other concern I have at the moment is the sort of sense of divisiveness that is being caused on this net zero issue. This is something that we all need to get behind. There needs to be, and there is really, cross-party consensus on tackling climate change. That has to continue. And I think that the fear I have is that by not addressing the range of things that we can do to address the climate crisis, and by pouring subsidies into an untested technology, as Selaine said, we're on the road to nowhere, really.
Thank you. Mark, Kate's used this word gamble to describe subsidies for BECCS, but I imagine for biomass more generally, and concerns from Selaine and Maxwell on that. The reality of this is that these technologies have to be subsidised to be viable. What's your response to the suggestion that we're taking a huge punt when there are technologies that we know do work, where that subsidy, at least many would argue, it would be much better spent?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I want to put this subsidy question in context. So when we say we're subsidising the sector, what we mean is that the existing fleet of bioenergy, biomass power sites, were supported through the renewable obligation in the 2020s, renewable obligation in 2020s, and more recently some CFDs, the very first CFDs, were biomass conversion. In the last 4 allocation rounds, there's been no subsidies for new biomass plants. The sector is not looking to build new biomass plants. The existing subsidies for unabated biomass will start to come to an end in 2027 in line with their existing contractual arrangements. That is the investment that the government put in place in order to ensure we have a viable bioenergy sector in this country that has helped deliver a significant proportion of our existing carbon budgets to date. So when we're talking about subsidy, it's not a case that we're throwing it at biomass when we should be doing other things. I completely agree with Selaine and Kate when they say we should be doing other things as well. As I stated, we need to be doing an awful lot more wind, we need to be doing an awful lot more solar, but the point is that these work within an energy system. Biomass provides baseload capacity, it provides grid security when other renewables can't do that. For obvious reasons. So it is about a whole solution. It is about building a whole net zero power system, and you need it all. Is it a gamble? Well, no, not really. There are already carbon capture storage facilities operating in the US. Granted, they are not on biomass sites, they're on bioethanol sites, but they are already commercial and operational. In this country, Drax is capturing about a ton a day of carbon in their demonstration site, and so it can be done. That obviously, that's not to say it is yet commercial. We recognise it's not yet commercial, but that is why we're talking with government about sensible support mechanisms in order to see the commercial reality of these sites delivered, and that is where future support is required. But in all of those discussions, we're very clear that the future is not about subsidy for bioenergy carbon capture storage. The future is about a viable market that pays for negative emissions, that you are being paid for delivering that removal of carbon out of the atmosphere. And to do that, you need an active carbon market. And so you need to get that going. Yes, we need to support the sector in order to do that. Yes, that is going to require some money. That is not either or in doing anything else. But the long-term aim is very much getting a vibrant negative emissions market in place and operational, which the UK can really lead in order to ensure that these sites are commercial.
Thank you. And then Maxwell, final one from me. On this subsidy point, you're a good free marketeer. You're sceptical of the government throwing money at anything, I think, a lot of the time. And I think there'll be plenty of people in the Conservative Party who are very sympathetic to that argument as well. But isn't the reality of the situation we're in with climate change and reaching net zero that we can't pretend that this is possible without subsidy? And we are, even if, to make exactly the point Mark said, that some government support is going to be necessary, not just for biomass, but for other sectors as well, and we've already done it with wind and solar. We are going to need to do that in order to stimulate the private market, that I think we probably all agree is a more effective way. of delivering a lot of these energy solutions?
There is about $3 trillion of private capital floating around for green investment in the world. You're right in saying that, I mean, you'll never hear the words, we support a subsidy from the Adam Smith Institute. I think I'd be sacked on the spot, actually, if I said that. But the thing is that, we can recommend, negatives on that, I'd say. So a border-adjusted carbon tariff, for example, would be a wonderful solution, I think, and would definitely stimulate the market without having to throw taxpayer money at problems that, I'm not a fan of the precautionary principle. I think taking gambles is a good idea, especially with energy. I just don't think taxpayer support on that is a good idea. And as I said, there's a lot of money floating around, for this sort of stuff. It's about making the right business, case to these investors. There's a lot of dry powder floating around, especially in the especially in asset management, to basically spend on these quite expensive projects. We submitted some evidence to Parliament a couple of months ago with a couple of emeritus professors from Oxford, one in chemistry, one in bioengineering. And we had a look at biomass. We said we would lump it in with gas and oil. And now look, gas and oil do actually receive a technical subsidy because they can claim back VAT. Fine, and I think that should be the same for biomass essentially. But again, giving them cash grants, I don't think is a very good idea. I mean, why else would Drax have a stand here at the Conservative Party conference if they weren't looking for more subsidies from the government? I mean, it's really quite simple. If we want to talk about unlocking net zero, we have to look at our planning regime. Why is it that Hinkley Point C had to submit 11,467 planning documents only for it to be held up in the courts? If you want to unlock growth, if you want to unlock, good clean energy and a diverse market, we need to turn the government away from blockers and into doers. The same goes for, I've already brought up the Aquin interconnector. I think that's really important. Penny Mordaunt's currently, protesting that very heavily, even though, as I said, it could provide about 5% base load for the UK energy market. A further point, and I'll finish on this, I do not believe that the government, the department itself, really understand what the future electricity needs will be by 2050. It's going to be ginormous, and I think the amount of subsidy that would be required to get to that point would essentially make the Treasury burst into flames, which I don't think would be good for climate change either. So we need to not just be looking at the current end 2027, the current business contracts end. We need to be looking at what that means for 2050, and I think we really need to be unlocking and allowing investment to flow into the country. That means cutting regulations, cutting tax, dealing with inflation, to allow for a real private market energy. And I think I'm a big fan of free market environmentalism. I think we can do it.
Thank you, and I'm obviously a scrupulously impartial chair, but I will just say, please, can we build more stuff? Because I think it's the solution to so many of this country's woes at the moment. I'm hoping I've got a colleague somewhere with a roving microphone. Questions, I'll go to this gentleman. Sorry, I'm making Finn run massively. I'm going to go to this gentleman at the front here first, and then the two gentlemen over here, and I'll take them as a three. And please be grateful. Please do state your name and affiliation. I will make the customary plea for a nice short question.
Graham Hutton, County Councillor in Staffordshire, chair of my local association. Question for Kate. I live in the country, a mile from my house is a commercial forest. It's just had a clear fell. There is almost as much wood left, piled up. They've just replanted and they just bulldoze it up, and it's going to rot over the next 20 years. Surely, all that could have gone into biomass.
Thank you very much. And then the two gentlemen by the aisle over here next, please.
Good morning. Tony Gould, Town Councillor and Climate Emergency Doubter. I see that you have a polarised panel, which is very interesting, but my thought I would leave with you is that why are we cutting trees down on another continent, bringing it to the UK to burn it, when from a calorific value point of view we have coal in our ground? We also have oil and we have gas, which are far more effective. Also, because a national grid is running or teetering on the brink, we have opened up a coal-fired power station. So I think there's huge conflict in what is going on here. As regards the subsidy for Drax, I'm sorry, I bought into the company when it was doing well. The political implications mean it is not doing so well on the stock market, so I pulled out. And that is really a conscious decision not to support subsidies. If we want bioenergy and renewables, we have solar production and we have wind production. We cannot store it. There is a thought that we store it in batteries, but they have a spontaneous fire problem, and the largest battery storage in the world is in Australia. It is currently on fire and they cannot put it out. So my answer is use electrolysis and spare energy from solar and wind. You create hydrogen, which you can store, and that's what you want to use in future vehicle transport and not electric batteries.
Thank you, and then the gentleman behind.
Hi, Robert McElveen from the Mineral Products Association. So our members include cement manufacturers who have, over the recent decades, put a huge amount of effort into switching away from coal as the primary energy input to things like meat and bone meal, shredded tyres, solid recovered fuel, sewage pellets, anything you can do to get off coal, because we are very aware that we absolutely have to do it. There's a huge risk with subsidy that actually you end up perversely moving things away from the best use, so both environmentally and economically efficient use, and actually end up deterring investment. Just to very quickly come on to BECCS, we have to do CCS anyway because we've got such a high proportion of process emissions, so only about a third of our emissions are from the fuel. So would it be making the best and most efficient use of it to not constrain the discussion to electricity and energy on that side, but actually to let the market decide which companies are most desperate for it and let them pay for it, and that would probably be my members.
Thank you very much. Kate, I'm going to come to you first, and I'll let you respond to any of those questions, but I wonder if you particularly look at this, the commercial forestry point the gentleman made over there. I think Selaine alluded to before. There is a hierarchy of uses here. You know, we're not talking about chopping down tree and necessarily using the whole tree for electricity. I think there are all sorts of things you can do, but when you are talking about a situation the gentleman raises where there is a waste product there, surely there is a case for using it.
Yeah. No, I agree, and I don't know the specific situation you're talking about, and would be happy to look at it afterwards. I think our point is, and I'll try and link the 2 points there, that for that, you know, we will need some CCS, but only for the very hardest to abate sectors, and that means looking at subsidy arrangements and energy plans completely differently to how we are now. I feel like at the moment there's no plan. There's absolutely no plan as far as I can work out. We've got some of the most ambitious targets in the world and no real plan to deliver them. If we had a real plan to deliver them, you'd be able to say, well, okay, we're going to need this tiny amount of BECCS or CCS for this particular industry at this time. It's for the last mile stuff, whereas at the moment it's being subsidised as if it can be a vast, a major part of our energy system in the future. And there are alternative paths that we need to look at. So, I just think we are, we're missing a bunch of things because we don't have a plan, and because we don't have a plan, we're not, it's just chaotic. But we will need it for the hardest to abate sectors, as you refer to. Just on the deforestation point, we agree that we shouldn't be deforesting trees and importing them to this country for BECCS. And part of the trouble is that carbon accounting rules mean that the UK could import that wood from elsewhere and not account from the emissions for that land use change, because we're not required to account for offshore emissions, and then claim that BECCS as being carbon negative. I wouldn't agree with you on coal, oil and gas, though. The International Energy Agency has said there's absolutely no place for oil and gas in the future, and we shouldn't be new oil and gas in the future, and we shouldn't be opening Rosebank. We shouldn't be, doing all of these things in the North Sea. Just doesn't make any sense.
Selaine, you wanted to come in on those points as well?
Yeah, thank you. I think the wastewood point is a really interesting one, and if there is anyone in the room that can help on this one, I was with my farmers on Friday, and where they're planting more hedges, they also have more hedge offcuts, which they're not allowed to burn on their farms. So if there's anyone here that can help my farmers collect it up and send it somewhere to do something useful with, they'd be very grateful. I think we really need to look at these whole cycles, and when we talk about circular economies, I think the same is true with trees. How do we ensure that we optimise the carbon that's in that tree? And it's pointless leaving it to rot. That creates its own emissions. And with regards to the numbers, with Kate saying, I have to have a lot of sympathy with this, that the Drax site currently emits 12 million tonnes of carbon a year, and now we know that. Surely we should be looking to reduce that, not just bury it. So it's lovely that they're picking up 1 million tonnes. That's still 11 million that's floating around. That if we could move to a different source of energy, now that we understand this better, and as a mathematician myself, the frustration over the fact that we can't seem to add up our carbon just is immense. We'd much like to see a system. But with regards to the storage element, so obviously I've championed this floating offshore wind project to go out, which will have obviously more energy when the wind blows than we can use. But I also now have hydrogen companies coming to me to say they would like to build a hydrogen plant in my constituency. But to John's point, we have to sort out the planning, because as I said to the gentleman, he said this will be 500 jobs. So behind the hydrogen plant, the vision is that the hydrogen would power the 250 vessels that we will need to go out and service the wind turbines, that we would then decarbonise the ports along the coast with the hydrogen that came in. But there would then be enough left over that we would probably put a fertiliser plant on the back, which obviously I'm a very farming rich community, which all sounds very exciting. So I looked at this lovely man and said, so how many jobs is this going to create? And he's like, this is 500 new jobs. I said, well, don't even think about it unless you're building me 500 houses. Because in a constituency like mine, we have nowhere for anyone to live. And it's, in my mind, a completely circular argument that we're chopping down trees so that we can burn them. Apparently, I've been told it's 11 million tonnes of virgin timber that the REA members are using, and 4.5 million tonnes of waste of our own timber basket. A sixth of virgin timber in the UK is burnt. In my mind, I'd far rather and I think we need to look at all of these different options, and I would like a very clever mathematician, far cleverer than me, to put some sums in place, because it does feel that some of these conversations are very logical to us, but somebody with a big spreadsheet. So that over to Rishi, because he's the spreadsheet man.
He is. Maxwell, I'm going to turn to you next. I wondered if you come back on the gentleman's point about subsidies sort of creating some perverse incentives, which I saw you nodding at, but I wonder if you get to what are the other incentives that we therefore need to be using? If you don't like subsidy, what should we be doing to try and roll out whatever energy sources we're trying to promote more readily?
Well, I was going to say, someone's been reading that Adam Smith, and I'm very glad to hear it. This is good news. But I think there is a very clever little mechanism called a profit margin, which I think is fantastic. And if there is demand for this, and I certainly believe there is, that is enough incentive, and it always has been for all of human history. If you want to get something built, you want to get something rolled out quickly, just make clear to the market that there is a market for it, essentially, and private business will come along because they want to make money. It really is that simple. I don't think the government needs to get involved in this. Subsidies are incredibly distortive. If you look at the global economy, there are trillions of dollars that are just distorted all over the place. It holds back scientific advancement, it holds back people's well-being, it holds back communities. Subsidies are a very bad thing, and I'll be washing out my mouth with mouthwash later for saying the word subsidy so much. I think it's a terrible, terrible thing. Can I quickly come on to the battery point? Similar area. I share some of the concerns about battery energy. It's still in development. Let's give it a chance. Let's let the scientists and the private capital come around to build these things. Tesla wouldn't have been a thing 30 years ago, and now we're getting to the point where Tesla is, or even the Chinese electric car market, the largest in the world. Is rolling out an incredible pace because the money's there to do it. I think the market can move in beautiful ways. The invisible hands, to quote Adam Smith, will push investment forward, and we will have enough time. But if you're taking money out of the economy through subsidies or borrowing, so future people will have to pay for that, I just think it's a very, very bad idea. Business will kickstart itself. We don't need the government to come in. You don't need lobbyists to go in. I used to be a lobbyist, no for my shame. Arguing for these things. I think at the end
for Drax certainly, but the impact on land use, if we're going to have a rising share of biomass, which is certainly what a lot of people are arguing for, how are we going to meet that demand without causing some of the problems that Kate alluded to with competing land use for nature, for farming, for food production? Where do we draw the line? How do you believe we can get that right?
Yes, there's a lot to pick up there and a lot to respond to. But start off with your question and the question from the floor in relation to why are we importing biomass. We're importing biomass because South America has some of the largest availability of trees and woody biomass anywhere in the world. The amount of to put it in context, only about 1% of the US southeastern biomass is used in bioenergy each year, and the area it covers is 4 to 5 times the size of the UK. This is a huge resource. And to pick up on Maxwell's point, he's saying free markets and the importance of this. The reason the bioenergy sector exists is because of a free market and understanding how biomass as a forestry industry operates. You do not cut down trees to burn them. That is not what we're here to do. You cut down trees because it's a forestry industry, and if you pay for that product, that encourages the landowner to sustainably manage that forest to make sure that he has forests in the future and future product to sell into, namely furniture production, paper production, sawmills and the like. It is the waste product, it is the lowest value bits of wood that end up in bioenergy. You do not cut down a tree to get the lowest value product because it wouldn't be economic to do that. So the point is that low value product is still finding a use within that circular economy, and it's providing that additional revenue streams for the forestry communities, for forest owners in the US, and for landowners here in the UK. To answer your question, how do we ensure, therefore, that we meet the demand? I am fully supportive of seeing an increase in domestic feedstock production. We absolutely have to do that. There are innovative ways of doing that as well. We work with a number of developers and we work with National Farmers Union to look at how the agricultural sector could be using things like miscanthus or willow production or short rotation coppice within the UK, and ensuring landowners are appropriately rewarded for the production of that kind of biomass that could be used within bioenergy. The importance there is making sure again that that's done correctly. This is all crops that are predominantly grown on low economic value land. It's not supposed to be competing with food production, and we're very clear about that. But there is a lot of land which you can talk to any farmer and they say, this is land that's not doing anything for us and we could be doing something else with it. And not only that, but if you look at some of the scientific studies around miscanthus or willow production, if done correctly in the right places, it's actually increasing biodiversity and supporting environmental benefits as well as locking carbon in the soil. So there's all kinds of other benefits that when this is done correctly can be realised and can be addressed, and that's what should be rewarded.
Brilliant. Any more questions from the floor? I think the lady at the back has caught my eye, so I'll go to her first.
Yes, thank you. My name is Jessica Fleming. I'm a county councillor from Suffolk. I'm also a geologist and have been working as a consultant for about 40 years both here in America. I think there are a lot of problems with biofuels which have been highlighted. One, of course, is the flawed carbon accounting system which we have, which with my rudimentary understanding of maths frustrates me dreadfully. This has got to be changed and done properly. It's way overdue. Please listen to that, if nothing else. The other problem with biofuels is the offshoring of emissions. And a third problem, of course, is what we should be looking at, is ecological footprint rather than just narrowing in on carbon. I think ecological footprinting is a far superior way of measuring environmental progress and sustainability. And we've stopped talking about it because it tells us uncomfortable things about how we should be behaving. The biological footprint of burning purpose-built timber, wood or plant material is worse than coal. And, I think, is it Mark? I think your projections are somewhat naive in that the majority of the energy that Drax produces is from sort of waste stuff that nobody wants. That is simply not the case. I think we've got to put a stop to the false accounting system that's driving things in the wrong direction. Invest in baseload nuclear geothermal, those can provide what we want, not biofuels.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The gentleman at the front here, and then the gentleman on the... Well, why don't you go to the gentleman on the aisle here as you're walking past him? I won't make you run around too much, Finn. Thank you.
My name's Marcus Horror. I've got no affiliation with anything at all, just interested in the subject.
Mm-hmm.
But it does seem to me that we have all the ideal things what you want to do, but there is a cost associated with producing our electricity. Maxwell sort of said we want double the electricity in a few years' time, but we are competing with other countries in the world, so the price of our electricity has got to remain, I'll just use the word competitive, with other countries.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And then the gentleman here. It's been...
I'm Burhan from Warwick. I'm a student. The question which I have first towards Mark is, I understand that we're not going to be building trees to cut them down. I was thinking that in terms of government subsidies, the way I understand, we can invest in the processing of the wood for burning or the actual forest itself. So one question to you, Mark, is would you support the government subsidising the building of more forests, and then as a byproduct that would incentivise wood burning? And then the question I have to the rest of the panellists is, if there's an abundance of waste wood, what other use do we have for it?
Thank you very much. Mark, I'll come to you first this time. And again, keen for you to respond to all three of those questions. I know some of them have been aimed in more in your direction. But I wonder, particularly looking at this ecological footprint point that the lady made at the back. You talked before about miscanthus and willow and about some of the other things to do, but I think one of the huge challenges we have in the UK is not just our climate targets, but our nature targets, the need to make sure that we use our land, yes, for food production, yes, for energy generation, but also for making sure we hit our biodiversity targets. And the risk, many would argue, with greater biomass rollout, in terms of domestic feedstock sourcing, is that you're going to make what is already a very difficult job, and a job we're well behind on, even harder.
Yeah, no, thank you. So start off with carbon accounting and ecological footprints, and thank you very much for the question. I mean, the first thing to say is I have no doubt that carbon accounting methodologies can be further improved along with scientific evidence, but it is important to understand the basis on which they already operate. And the way that the bioenergy industry currently works is aligned with the IPCC's greenhouse gas emissions portfolios. And that was again reviewed only 2-3 years ago, where the several hundred scientists said, yeah, this is the correct way of looking at how we look at carbon accounting. When you remove forestry from land, that is where you look at the carbon removal, not at the point at which it is burnt, in which case you'd be counting it twice. And that is the basis for how we look at our carbon accounting currently. Going beyond that, looking at the ecological footprint, the current sustainability governance arrangements do look at the full life cycle of that of those feedstocks, not just from a carbon accounting point of view, but also from an ecological biodiversity point of view, looks at land use change, and looks at even social impacts and how it impacts on the area. And as I mentioned, a lot of the industry, in order to demonstrate that they are meeting those governance arrangements, use certification methods which are independently verified. So outside of their use, so things like the Sustainable Biomass Programme are independently audit all of the biomass supply chains each year to demonstrate that the emission reductions and full life cycle impact and ecological impact are being met. The importance, therefore, is if we're saying we need to do more and we need to look at further tightening of our carbon accounting arrangements, then fine, yes, let's do that, but let's use the science to do that. Let's understand what is already in place. Just saying, oh, it's not good enough without telling me what about what is there isn't good enough isn't a conversation. That's not going to get us anywhere. So understand the existing governance arrangements, which are extensive. Criticise them, absolutely, and let us make sure we're doing things correctly. But let's have a proper discussion about what is already happening and what, therefore, you want to see improved. The final point, just to answer this question here, yes, absolutely, I want to see support for landowners, farm owners, to be doing the correct things to their land. So one way we've been campaigning around that is around the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which is a government-based payment towards agriculture and farmers, in which we argue quite strongly that farmers and agriculture should be rewarded for the environmental benefits that they produce to their land, ensuring that if they are choosing to grow bioenergy feedstocks, that they're doing it correctly. So they're not being rewarded for the bioenergy feedstocks, they're being rewarded for, say, if you grow miscanthus, that locks carbon away in the soil, so you get rewarded from that. If you grow willow, then you might be adding to flooding defence, it adds roughage to the area, and you can be rewarded for that. And there's also plenty of scientific studies that show biodiversity gains as well, where it is done correctly. So yes, fully support subsidising those areas where it is being done appropriately.
I'm going to go to Maxwell first. I can sort of predict the scream that's going on inside your head about all of this mention of subsidy, but I think one of the challenges the UK's really had on the nature point, to take the gentleman's point here, is actually we all agree with the price mechanism in principle, but the problem for so much of the natural world is that's not been properly priced, and there isn't a kind of economic value seen for a lot of it. We all know we need to massively ramp up our tree planting. We all know that we need to do more for biodiversity. What mechanisms can we use, if it's not subsidising forest growth, what mechanisms can we use actually to make sure a price is put on this area that the market isn't really rewarding properly at the moment?
So let's quickly define what a price is. A price is just an information transmission mechanism. The problem is, in these areas we have asymmetric information because the farmers don't have access to the market, or those with those waste products don't have access. I think it's incumbent on companies who want to buy these products, they should be pushing more towards opening those markets up. Again, screaming in my head over subsidies, you're right. The government's not the fix for this. I think it's incumbent to the private sector to reach out and to really try and find good uses to create a proper secondary market for these waste products. Absolutely. That is a failure of the private sector. I think they'll get there. I think they don't like the idea of waste. No company really does. So I think give it time, but don't give it subsidies. Can I quickly come to the carbon accounting? We have a serious problem in this country of very bad statistics. I, for example, do a lot of work on pensions, and particularly the state pension. And I was looking at the ONS, for example. When the ONS calculates how to get to one of the key areas of the triple lock, they take 1% of PAYE payments, and that's it. They don't take 100%. They don't take any, they don't take any of the rest of kind of the payments market, including in distribution from government and also self-employed people. I like to call the ONS Swiss cheese. It stinks and it's full of holes. It's not good, but there's a general problem across government in terms of its accounting, and carbon accounting comes into this very much. It's very, very poor, as is why we advocate for border-adjusted carbon tax, because that's a better way of using the markets to feed information in, so you can tax these areas properly. I was also just looking at what the used to be BEIS committee was saying for the future of energy. Current consumption of energy in oil equivalent hours is 1,976 terawatt hours. The Committee for 2050 Energy believe that we only need 971 terawatt hours by 2050. The numbers don't make sense there. If you really have to think about how much electricity we'll be using in the future, it is much, much, much higher. It's back to that accounting point. They're very bad numbers, and we need to have a proper look at our statistical backgrounds and the statistical information going into the policies being made. I'm
afraid I would probably cut you off there for
fine.
time. If that's right, I'm very
That's fine,
conscious of
that's
time,
fine.
but thank you very much. I'm going to give Selaine and Kate a chance for a final word to take in those questions. Selaine, you first, and then to Kate.
On the price point, I think with the contract for difference for all of the different new renewable energy, up until AR5, it has been very successful. But I think it's also important to know what those prices are. And so the strike price for wind in recent rounds has been around £50 per megawatt hour. And 47 for solar. The current strike price for Drax is 119. So there's already a price differential that we're paying. And yes, fine, that gives you security of supply and baseload, and we should pay for that. But I think there is already a price differential should factor in. And when it comes to farmers, and I can just do a pitch for your next session at 12:30, and I'll be here all over again to talk about regenerative farming. But I do think there is a real need when we look at this land use strategy to understand that farmers are actually there to produce food, and that not only do we have an issue over energy security, we also have an issue on food security, and that we as a nation do need to get some balance back into this. And I think it is, you know, I represent a lot of very small farmers in North Devon. They don't have bits of their land that are underproductive that they can randomly pop a forest in. And I think, you know, there is a real misunderstanding between the very large landowners and the small ones, and they are vital to the lady's point at the back about nature and renewal of that environment. But these are really complex conversations. You know, there's a forest that's been turned down because it upsets some wading birds. I've got Natural England advising farmers to ignore the planning advice and just put up the slurry store because it's polluting the waters. I think, you know, we need as a nation to come together as to how we're going to use our land. Our planning is shocking, and get solar panels on roofs, get some food in our fields, and actually get some balance back in our system.
Final minute for you.
At this point on carbon accounting has come up a bit. I've really sympathised with the lady at the back, but I think it's worth saying that we're not going to change our international carbon accounting rules. As you said, Mark, they've been defined by the IPCC. Unlikely to want to do that, and I don't think there'll be much benefit in it. But what we can do is change how much trust we put in the figures that come from somewhere like Brazil. I mean, you were talking about the availability of wood in Latin America, and we need to talk about the politics behind this. In Brazil, you know, up until recently we had Bolsonaro in charge, and Bolsonaro supporters are still very much in charge in areas in Brazil, in states in Brazil. And so when you talk about the forestry industry in quite a neutral term and being able to encourage the forestry industry, that's a very different matter when you're talking about many countries in Latin America.
Just for a very quick point of clarification, when I talked about Southeast, I was talking about Southeastern US, not Brazil. But please,
Okay.
take the point, absolutely.
Okay, but you know, and you know, even in the US, then I mean, we need to properly account for this and think about the politics of it, because the subsidies that we have in the UK can drive illegal behaviour elsewhere, or can incentivise illegal behaviour elsewhere and be taking trees from completely the wrong places. And this goes back right to the beginning, the need to have a plan that takes into account all of these issues and not trust quite so much the carbon accounting principles that go on from elsewhere. And one last thing, which is to say that, you know, Bex assumes that burning wood is going to be instantly zero carbon because you can regrow trees. Trees take a long time to grow, and I think that is, for me, the principle behind this, which I think is so damaging.
Thank you very much, Kate. Well, Selaine's already alluded to, the next event in this room in 30 minutes' time is regenerative agriculture. Can farmers go green without going into the red? So if you're a fan of agriculture or Selaine Saxby, you can be back in half an hour for that. In the meantime, can I encourage you all to use your half an hour break before you're definitely back here to go to the Send stand, sign up as a supporter if you haven't already, why not? Learn about today's campaign, which I think Kate alluded to earlier, cut taxes, insulate homes, lower bills, all about energy efficiency. Thank you very much to Maxwell, Selaine, Mark and Kate for a very interesting discussion. Please give them a hand.